Good morning. This is Alexis from Groundswell. I'm here with Elizabeth this morning, and we are happy to present with you our Farming for Justice monthly discussion group. This month, we will be talking about how our equity policy has shaped Groundswell Center as an organization. And so just want to say good morning to you all. And we like to start off all of our programs, workshops, and events here at Groundswell by acknowledging the land that we're on. So this morning, I want to acknowledge the Cayuga Nation, the Gayokono, and the land that we are on, which is unceded. In current history right now, the Cayuga Nation spends time protecting their land. They have 24-hour security as a way to prevent anything from happening on their land that shouldn't. And so I want to take a moment to acknowledge that the war against colonization is still happening, and that our Indigenous relatives are fighting that fight every day. And so here on the screen, there's a map. You can see the title of the website link, native-land.ca. If you go to that website, you can see what native land that you're on. And oftentimes it's in one of its native languages. In this instance, it's in one of the other Haudenosaunee languages, how to say Cayuga. But the Cayuga call themselves Gayokono. And then I just want to take a moment to let you know about our upcoming Farming for Justice topics. So in just a couple of weeks, because we had to postpone this one, on Tuesday morning, October 8th at 9 a.m., we're going to be talking about how green is the new Green Deal for farmers. We will have Elizabeth Henderson talking about the more regional aspect of the Green Deal, and we will have some people from the local community talking about how the Green New Deal is affecting us in a more local perspective. On Wednesday, November 13th, we will have our Farming for Justice with some academic scholars and farmers from, I would say, the Midwest and the Northeast as a whole region, and the topic of the Farming for Justice discussion will be queering sustainable agriculture.
So just a brief bit about Farming for Justice. It's a discussion group that Groundswell started about a year and a half ago, and is designed to bring people together, farmers, food system workers, nonprofit workers, beginning farmer training, service providers, really anybody involved in food and farming, to have discussions at the intersection of farming and justice. So you can see some of our past topics on our website, and there's recordings of almost all of those topics that we've held and discussion groups that we've held on our blog. So we'll always try to record them and post them. We do ask that you complete a really short evaluation form after the session today. It helps us keep these discussion groups free, and compensate presenters when we have them from outside the organization. And there is a link on this screen, but we'll also email it to you so that we can remind you to fill it out. So it really helps us a lot if you just take a few moments to fill it out. Logistically speaking, Farming for Justice, obviously you're joining through Zoom, or you've either phoned in or joining on the computer. And if you're new to Zoom, what we typically find works best is actually to keep you all muted, though sometimes we will unmute you and bring you in. Sometimes people are calling from a perspective that is always great to share. So sometimes we'll do that, but otherwise you're welcome to type into the chat, and you should be able to either scroll, like kind of hover over the bottom of your screen if you don't see the chat box, or at the top of your Zoom, and display the chat window. And then you can type questions in there. Sometimes we'll ask you to type questions or answers to questions that we ask. So feel free to use the chat box, just writing to us at Groundswell, or posting things to everybody. And if you have any technical difficulties, just type into the chat box to Groundswell, and we can help figure those out. And I think, yeah, that's kind of main logistical points. So thanks for being here today. So just a little about ourselves. So I'm Elizabeth. I'm the executive director here at Groundswell Center for Local Food and Farming. I've been here in this role since 2016, early 2016. And I'm also a farmer. I co-run Wellspring Forest Farm, which is an agroforestry farm with my husband, just outside of Ithaca. And I am a white Jewish woman. I grew up in upstate New York with a fair amount of privilege and access to resources. And part of my work now is really understanding my role with that power and privilege, and figuring out how we can create a more just food system from my perspective. So we'll be talking a little bit more about all of this throughout today.
And then, as I said earlier, my name is Alexis. I'm the Farming and Food Justice Program Coordinator at Groundswell Center. I've been here at Groundswell for a little bit over 6 months, learning about our local farming economy, learning about our local agricultural economy, learning about the nuances around those two economies as it relates to race, ethnicity, and culture. I myself am Indigenous. I'm Guanyi. My grandmother and my family was from the Caribbean islands. I'm also part Apache and Comanche on my father's side, and I grew up in upstate New York.
And so we'll ask you if you're comfortable posting into the chat box, typing into the chat to everybody, just giving some context of who you are. That might be your race or your ancestry or your culture. It might be the organization you're with or the role you have there, and you know, what brings you to the Farming for Justice discussion group today when we're talking about equity in beginning farmer training organizations. So go ahead and type into the chat if you're so willing, just so we can all see, and that will help us frame our conversations today a bit better. And as you're doing that, we'll continue on.
So on today's agenda for Farming for Justice, our discussion group, we will be talking about what is Groundswell Center for Local Food and Farming. We will be talking about our current and past history. We will be talking about the steps of assessment and organizational development that we've made around equity, and then the steps that we've taken to instate this policy of equity within our organization. We will also be opening it up for discussion. We'll be discussing our challenges, our successes, and then obviously any questions or concerns, thoughts that you have, you're always welcome to share at any point. We will also leave time at the end of this short presentation to talk about all of this stuff. And so before we really get into our actual equity policy, our statement, it's important to acknowledge the history of agriculture and racism in the United States. And so when we're talking about equity, we are also acknowledging the history of colonization, the history of slavery, which also is the exploitation of immigrant labor, prison labor, amongst many other types of communities in the United States. And basically, it's this understanding that our economy as it is now in the United States, because of the way that the country was founded, relies and is based off of labor, blood, all of the resources of the historically marginalized communities in order for the economies that we profit off of to flourish. And agriculture is certainly one of those economies. And at Groundswell here, and acknowledging that we're always working towards to being an anti-racist and multicultural organization. And then so for a little bit more context, these are some slides that I've pulled from the US Ag Census that came out this year, but it was from 2017 because of all that time to actually process the data. And basically here, it's showing that the top 4% of all US farms produce more than 3/4 of all ag production. So if this sounds familiar to you, that's very similar to the top 1% of the global economy is responsible for a lot of the rest of the economy and how it works. So the agricultural economy in the US does not vary that much. But also for some more perspective, in this graph, you can see that basically the top part of the graph where you have those smaller numbers, 8 and 9, you know, those are the number of farms that produce $5 million or more per year. And then at the lower end of the graph, you have a much higher number of farm size, which has increased. So those are small farms, and they make less than $2,500 a year. And so Groundswell, in our programming, in our workshops, our events, everything that we do here, our target is the small farms. And as defined by the USDA, small farms produce less than $2,500,000 a year. 250,000, sorry, zeros. And then also from a more demographic perspective, the vast majority of farmers are white. 95% of farmers are white. And although that number has been decreasing over the last 10 years or so, it's still a really large number of white farmers versus minority farmers. And so these are just some numbers from the USDA 2012 Census of Agriculture, and then the numbers in red that are asterisked are the numbers from the 2017 census. So here we have about a decade of numbers as far as the way that diversity is increasing in agriculture, but still the vast majority of farmers are white.
So thanks, folks, for sharing. I see the chat box, and it's great to get a sense of who's on the call. And we also have a member of our Equity and Accountability Committee in the room with us too. So it's really helpful to understand the context of some context for what people are showing up to have this discussion, from what perspectives, from what backgrounds. And so and that's also really part of this process is a lot of self-awareness. So so thanks. You can continue sharing if you haven't shared yet in the chat box. So just a little context for where we're coming from as we speak from the Groundswell perspective on this work. We are in upstate New York, and upstate New York is not the Hudson Valley, just outside New York City, but it's actually further up the state and further west. And so this is the Finger Lakes region of New York. It is predominantly rural. Ithaca is the largest town one of the larger towns in the Finger Lakes, along with Watkins Glen and Cortland, and Binghamton is not too far, so that's the southern tier. You can see the star actually where we are in Ithaca, where our office is, our incubator farm. But you can also see Rochester and Syracuse, which are some of the larger markets for farmers in this area. And we're about a 4.5 hour drive from New York City, where a lot of farmers also sell. So it is a very rural area of New York State. And so that does lead to some specifics around how we approach equity at our organization. the demographics of Tompkins County, which is the most diverse county in the Finger Lakes, are listed on the screen. And so we're still, you know, even though we're the most diverse county in the region, you can see the numbers that, you know, only 81% is still white in the county, and then other ethnicities and races making up the rest of that percentage. And so, we'll be talking a little bit more later about why this is essential, why this applies to how we build equity and diversity in our organization. So just a little context there. A little history of Groundswell to continue laying the context. We were founded in 2009. This is our 10th year. We just kicked it off earlier this month. We were founded by a group of farmers, community leaders, and community members to really address the growing interest of beginning farmers in our region. And in that time, just around the 2010, we were attracting so many beginning farmers to the area because there's such an abundance of experienced, sustainable, and regenerative farmers already here, and a pretty extensive local food system. So we were really founded to support that, and we still are one of the more popular areas in the country for farmers to move to start businesses. As of 2012, we were home to more than 30% beginning farmers, or farmers in this region were more than 30% beginning, and so I don't know where those numbers stand, but it's always been pretty strong. Initially, we were really looking to leverage the knowledge and success of the local organic farmers to provide effective farm-based education and training for other aspiring farmers, and to diversify and strengthen the regional food system. And over time, these goals and how we approach these goals and what these goals mean have changed, and that's where we'll be getting into today. If you're not familiar with us, we're pretty somewhat typical as far as our programs and our services as a farm service provider, nonprofit organization, similar to possibly some of you on the call and many across the country. We offer beginning farmer training programs, workshops, technical assistance, support, field days, those types of things. Farm business development classes and support, one-on-one guidance, mentorship, financial planning, market development, accessing new markets, wholesale, that type of stuff. And we have an incubator, a small incubator farm program that has been around since 2012, where we provide affordable land to farmers. In that program, 85% of the farmers are currently refugee farmers, and they're all able to grow the farmers there can grow annual crops at this point. So, and that program will be shifting over the next few years, which we'll talk about a little later. But part of that incubator farm mission is really addressing the land access issues that farmers of color face. All farmers, but especially farmers of color. So all of our programs and services prioritize support for refugees and producers of color, and we do that in various ways, which we'll be talking about. So just kind of what we stand for as an organization: we support beginning farmers, create affordable land access, collaborate for food justice, foster sustainable farming, so we do focus on regenerative and sustainability in our programs and services, and educate for success. And, you know, our mission luckily does commit us to thinking about equity and diversity in the food and farming landscape. And I know many of you, you know, on the call, many other service provider organizations, that may not be an element of your mission. But I think that, you know, one thing to recognize is like, what are we coming to this conversation from, what perspective, what goals, and you know, if you're an advocacy organization supporting beginning farmer, you know, easy access to help with making policies more supportive of farmers, to make farmers' lives easier. Like we all know that it's hard to be a farmer, it's hard to be successful, it's hard to access resources. You know, no matter what sector you're coming from in this work and how you're looking at supporting farmers, we all have a role in shifting the way the food system is. Alexis talked about how 95% of farm owners are white. And so any challenge that you're trying to address in your organization is hard for farmers, and only harder if you're a farmer from a marginalized group. And so I think, you know, part of what I see our role is in this work is really figuring out how we're supporting the voices not only of farmers, but of the farmers that are most disenfranchised. And you really have to start there, thinking about those access to resources, those inequalities, those oppressive forces. So in 2019, we established the core values that you see on the screen, just to really help us hone in on what's truly meaningful. The top list is really meaningful, but it's a little more vague. It's a little more common, and we really needed to hone in on what's actually making our work possible. And those are the four things: the farming and food abundance, really supporting that as a value of the food system, of the work that we're trying to support, regenerative agriculture, equity and justice, and relationship building. And these are outlined on our website. There's a drop down to our core values with more explanation about each of these. So we, at Groundswell, we really recognize that if we are going to shift to really uphold the equitable local food system part of our mission, we really needed to step back and look at our organization's way of being. You know, it's one thing to say, yeah, we need more diversity in our programs, or we need more diverse staff, but why? And why weren't we diverse? And it's not, you know, in one sense, it's simple because farming is a very white trade, but in another sense, it's very complex. And so as I became director in 2016, it was a really wonderful opportunity to spend the first year or two of my time here just talking to people and hearing what people think of Groundswell, how we're achieving our mission, meeting new people, meeting people that Groundswell lost relationships or ruined relationships with, and talking to those people, hearing stories, learning from our mistakes. And in 2016, I did recommit the organization to center equity in our efforts and in our mission. And so it wasn't that our mission was a beginning farmer training organization that also cared about food justice or committed, is that we need to actually commit to equity and justice in order to be a beginning farmer training organization. And that's a, you know, it's a slight change in phrasing, but if we don't center what we'll be talking about today in everything we do, then, which is hard, and I'm not saying that we're doing that perfectly whatsoever, but then it's an afterthought. And so we really spent some time just looking at our organizational development. And in that time, there were some growing pains. Some of the staff who were here were like, oh, I thought I was working at a beginning farmer training organization, not a food justice organization, and they decided to leave. And that's an important, you know, area of this process to realize that leadership or people who have been part of the organization for a really long time hopefully stay and commit even more, but some might decide that this isn't for them, and hopefully that's just it's not for them yet, but that was part of our experience. So we're going to tell you a little bit about our organizational development and some of the theories about how we approach looking at ourselves.
So this chart here has been taken from the Dismantling Racism Project text. It's a pretty lengthy text. I encourage all of you to look it up. I'll try and see if I can find a link to share it with you after today's discussion. But here on this table, you see there's 4 different categories. You have the first category to the far left, white culture, which it says doesn't intentionally exclude people of color, and it's actively recruiting with little success. Tokenizing is the commitment to eliminate discrimination in protocols, and 1 or 2 people of color might be in leadership positions. Also in this text from the Dismantling Racism Project, they do define tokenizing as a limited number of people. So kind of like pick one and only one from non-dominant groups that are chosen for prestigious positions in order to deflect the criticism of oppression. And then moving towards the right, we have multicultural. It reflects contributions, interests of diverse groups in its mission, operations, and services. And it recruits and celebrates diverse cultures and races. And then to the far right, we have anti-racist, which is you have your anti-racist white allies, and it also empowers people of color through the culture and the organization, policy, programs, and procedures. And then it goes a little bit more in depth into that on this chart here. And so there's an interesting interplay between multicultural and anti-racist. And we kind of were wondering, you know, what really comes first? And as we kind of read through it and looked at the text, you know, and really kind of tried to see where we fit in, it's more of a process. It's not really linear in the way that it looks on this table, but it's more of like a cyclical process of kind of going back and figuring out how to grow better and how to be accountable for each of who we are within the organization, and how to help hold other people in the organization accountable for becoming an anti-racist and multicultural organization.
One of the things that, you know, just an example of like white culture that's really common, and I think is possibly where Groundswell had been, and, you know, still can be at times, is like, with, you know, you have an intention to include people of color in your work. There's no intention to exclude, but to have one or two people of color involved in an organization where the culture is still very dominant white supremacist ways, systems of power, means that people of color aren't going to stay, don't want to stay, aren't valued and heard from their perspectives. And so I think it's a strong, I think that title is really strong, and it's easy for us majority white-led organizations or white people to want to say, well, we're not that, but it's actually the easiest place for us to fall. And the most dangerous, because it's the most hard to recognize that that's actually where you are. And so, you know, then moving towards tokenizing, like, is just as harmful, if not even more harmful, to the individuals experiencing it, and it's still upholding that white culture. So we'll be talking about cultural shift a little later, but that's really what this chart's showing.
And so just to reflect that, we kind of figured out, you know, the spectrum of things and how we fit on it, and different ways to move from one end of it to the other. And so as you see, we have diversity inclusion, which I think used to be really popular, and I think still are in some instances, as far as language around becoming a multicultural and anti-racist organization. But we kind of moved it to equity and justice, to instate these ways of thinking as an everyday belief and practice within the organization, and hopefully outside of the office as well, because it's an understanding that those practices will perpetuate a more positive anti-racist environment in the organization, in the office, and in our programming and the people that we reach. And then also just to recognize that, you know, on one end of the spectrum, you have a dominant white culture, and there's the expectation that marginalized people are going to fit into it. And then on the other end of the spectrum, it's an environment where everybody fits in and has equality in that sense, where there's not an expectation to fit into a certain culture when you're not from that culture, which also works on both ends of the spectrum.
So we just shared a bit of kind of background, which I think, at least to me, is a lot to think about. So if you've been with these groups before, you know we like to do breakout sessions. So I'm just gonna see what the question on the screen, you know, why are we talking about this? Whoops, this question is off the screen. Hold on a second. Can you break up groups from there?
Yeah, I think
okay. So let me get back to where we were. Sorry about that. The question on the screen, if I can get back there. is, why are we talking about this at Farming for Justice? We're talking about farming, the intersection of justice and equity, and even as, farm service providers, I saw some of you are garden educators working in urban aspects, like wherever you come from, why is this even a topic that we need to move towards an anti-racist organization? And so, so what we'll do is send you into breakout rooms with this question. We'll type this question into the chat box, and then we'll give you about, let's say, 8 minutes. You'll break into groups of 4 or so, and then you'll have the capacity to, you'll be unmuted and you'll be able to talk amongst yourselves to talk about your role in this work and why it's important. And then the breakout group will close automatically. It will give you a minute notice, and then we'll come back to the central. So hopefully that makes sense. So I'm gonna just, we'll type this question into the box, and then we'll send you into your breakout rooms, assuming everything works as we like it to, which it might not. So you can't do breakout rooms there either.
No.
Uh-oh, all right, we might just have to have you unmute yourself and share to the group. So let's do that instead, because I'm not seeing what's going on with our breakout room option. Normally there's just a click box, but not today. So so feel free to unmute yourself and share, why is this, why are we talking about this here as beginning farmer training service providers, as garden educators, as gardeners yourself, whatever you brought, I saw some of you post into the chat. You can unmute yourself and speak, and we'll hope that works pretty well. Go ahead, whoever would like to go first. You're also welcome to type it into the chat. Anyone? You can share too. Yeah, it's a lot to process. I hear that from Kate. You don't have to have formed thoughts in this work either. You can have, messy thoughts if you want to share too. That's okay too. And there'll be opportunity to share later. So no pressure, but we always like to give you all an opportunity to speak. You can speak too, Jay. No one's unmuting. All right. All right, we'll continue on then. When you have a burning thing to share, feel free to type it into the chat and we can make sure to fit it in. All right, so moving on. I don't know why you don't see what I see, but so we're gonna get into a little bit of, hold on, let me just restart this so you see what I want you to see on the screen. You're still not seeing what I want you to see. Mm-mm. Oh, it's showing you everything. I don't know why.
Presenter view, maybe?
Presenter view shows the notes, I think.
Oh, you're right.
But weird. Sorry, guys. Hold on just one sec. Yeah, it's normally play from current slide. All right, I guess you'll just see the upcoming slides. So I don't know why I'm not able to hide those anymore, but are you able to show them the screen still?
Yep.
Okay. So moving into our, moving into a little bit more about Groundswell. So just try to look at the main part of the screen and not the rest of the screen. I'm not sure why I'm not able to only show you that. But here we are anyway. We're going to tell you a little bit about just the steps that we've taken at Groundswell Center to get into this work and to move ourselves from that white culture part of the organizational development towards anti-racism. And like I said, we're ebbing and flowing throughout this chart all the time. We're doing some better in some areas and not as good in other areas. And I also just want to say, you know, all of you, as you posted into the chat, who you work for or what your roles are, you know, I, as the executive director, was able to and am able to lead this process forward and lead these steps forward. And that's a really lucky place to be at a small organization like Groundswell. I know not all of you are executive directors, and so you have to figure out, you know, what role are you able to play, and how are you able to bring in other leaders in this work and have more allies to move this forward. And even as executive director, obviously, I have people above me on our board and other people that are part of the leadership that either can push back or disagree with the approach. And so it is easier because I'm the ED. Doesn't mean any of it's easy, but really figuring out what your role is and how to build your capacity to move this work forward, finding other people who are committed to this with you in your organizations is going to be really helpful. So with that, step one, maybe not that obvious, is reflection and assessment, looking at, you know, yourself, looking at your organization and thinking about how are you contributing to building an equitable food system. You know, are you contributing to building an equitable food system? How are you not contributing to this? And you might fill in equitable food system with some other similar words for your work. How diverse is your leadership? How diverse are your participants? Why or why not? And when I mentioned that, you know, in upstate New York, we're 81% white in the most diverse county that we do our work in. And so we think about diversity and we think about wanting to have a majority multicultural organization. And then we also think about what's realistic. If we say 100% of the organization, you know, the goal is to not be white, that's not a very realistic goal when we're talking about farming, we're talking about Tompkins County and the diversity of the region. So that's where some of this, like, setting realistic goals will come into place, thinking about the assessment of your, you know, where you are. Step two is really the self. And I think this is, you know, probably the step that, especially as a white person I can speak from, is the easiest to skip. It's easy to kind of jump into, and perhaps some of you have experienced this, of, you know, just kind of joining forces with people of color, not recognizing my own power, my own privilege, and my own ways of upholding white supremacy, my own ways of being racist. And so really, you know, starting with your individual race awareness, taking anti-racism trainings, read a lot, finding other allies. If you're a white person, finding white allies in this work, not relying on people of color for your own self-education. And with this step, you're really asking, like, how are we upholding unjust and oppressive ways? How am I upholding unjust and oppressive ways? How am I upholding ways that hold up the white supremacy culture? And then this also really leads to, like, is the leadership of the organization on board with this, with their own self-education? And figuring out what self-education makes sense for white people, what self-education makes sense for people of color, and recognizing that that's not going to be the same thing. Step three, and this is, I think, often where I see people starting as step one. And one of the reasons of why it's, you know, self-education is above building relationships. I think people approach, especially white people approach us to be like, well, yeah, I know Black people, or I have Black friends, and like that, so I'm good. But building relationships with the BIPOC community, with refugees, with immigrants, especially with people that you, like, would quote unquote serve, is, you know, it's really different than knowing those people, understanding racial dynamics on a big level, on an individual level, being comfortable having those conversations, and realizing that to really dive into relationships of trust, not even just like acquaintance or tokenizing, really comes after self-awareness. Step four leads us kind of further down that chart, maybe moving from that white culture towards tokenizing, towards multicultural, where we're actually starting to shift culture in the organization. And this will be slow. It will be It will look different everywhere because it depends what cultures you have. But when you think about culture, we're thinking about how can we dismantle the oppressive structures that exist in food systems, in the nonprofit industrial complex, the power dynamic of our organizations, the way nonprofits are designed with a board and executive director, and then maybe a manager and then a coordinator. There's a whole hierarchical structure there that we have been really socialized to think is correct. And that's not actually the only way. And it doesn't work for having all voices heard, especially those that are typically marginalized. How is our organizational structure upholding those dynamics of power and really questioning that and looking within? The organizational culture really has to be ready and committed to understand new policies and how other power dynamics can work before it can move towards the next step, which is a shift in policy and control. So shift in culture, then shift in policy and control. For us, this started including things like writing the equity statement. We wrote bylaws. We were forming ourselves as an independent 501c3 at the time. So the timing worked out really well, but our equity efforts and commitments are in our bylaws. So they are like, the meat of the organization to have an equity and accountability policy and an equity and accountability committee. And we have some specifics for what those things mean. We reviewed all of our hiring policies and protocols, how we hire, what our interview process looks like, how long a job description has to be available and open, and how we promote that job. So we really, and amongst other things, we really spent a lot of time diving into hiring policies. Even what do interviews look like? You walk into an interview, there's 3 people maybe interviewing 1 person. It's already a power dynamic. And how do we shift that so that it might be something, it can be something that's less intimidating, that's has more equality and fairness to it. And then obviously implementing our power policies and control takes time and it's easier said than done. 6, communication. So communication obviously includes marketing and promotions. It's often I find it's often the easiest way that we might uphold white culture and tokenizing approaches. You see a lot of nonprofit organizations have, 1 person of color in a photo, and then the rest of their website, who knows what the rest of their website might say, or their advertising. Now you see a lot of Black Lives Matter logos on people's promotions, when it's sort of well, what's the context? What do you mean Black Lives Matter, in the sense of what you're actually doing as an organization? It's not enough to just stamp these things on what you do and call it good. And so communication, strategizing, internal and external, the language you use within the organization and the language you use externally in your promotions and marketing. There's a really great resource on communication. It's called the Storytelling Project. If you're interested in this, and it's a pretty long document, it's 80 pages. It's a curriculum that walks you through different communication strategies. And it kind of has this chart like we showed of white culture to anti-racist. There's a similar progression of storytelling and how we can move from tokenizing to actually celebrating diverse cultures. And then 7, establishing systems of accountability. For us, a big one is our Equity and Accountability Committee, but also we have accountability ways that we have started integrating into ourselves as a staff as well. And so we'll talk about those in a little bit. All right, that was a lot of talking. Moving on. We're gonna try this again. So I know some of you said you couldn't unmute yourselves. We wanted to see if any of these action steps are familiar to you in your own work, in your communities or your organizations, or if you have any other ways that you think would be good steps to move from white culture to anti-racism organizations or people. And again, you can unmute yourself. We'll just keep it out of the breakout groups and unmute yourself and speak, or type into the chat. So any of these action steps familiar to you, or do you have others to add, or do you have questions? Any questions?
And if you're having a hard time unmuting yourself and you want to unmute, we have the ability to help you from our end. So just kind of type it into the chat box. If you can't figure it out, we can help unmute you.
You could unmute all. That might be dangerous. Reframing the hiring process we're seeing on the chat box. And yeah, there's a lot to think about with the hiring process. You know, a lot of people are hired in different places based on, you know, maybe someone who you know through word of mouth, and those are the methods that take the longest to happen. And so a lot of times you see a job posting, you know, and it's like, oh, we're going to interview in a month and then we're going to hire in 6 weeks. And we get into that here too. Like, you find out you have a grant and you need to hire in the next 30 days so that you can get that grant started. But really figuring out how to lengthen the time that jobs are open, and who's even choosing the positions, you know, who's looking at the resumes. We always have a hiring committee that's members of our equity committee and a staff member that look at resumes. We value lived experience just as much as we value like technical schooled experience and things like that. Were you gonna say something?
I was just going to read a couple of comments about the first question, which was, what's our role as farm service providers, farmer training, or similar organizations to move towards anti-racist organizational development? Carmen wrote that food justice cannot be justice if it's not intersectional, such as achieving fresh food for all is dependent on achieving racial equity for all. And then Kate Cruz said that land and power are interconnected with race, and we can't do land or food justice without acknowledging systemic racism and shifting power. And I think both of those things are like really key points. And I'm happy that both of you shared that, your thoughts.
Is there one more message down there?
Yeah, there's Marjorie says she's been part of a group that used community-based participatory research as an approach to working in a diverse culture. And I think I would love to hear more about that and what that looked like on your end. And then Suzanne, hi Suzanne, is still responding to the first question, because we understand these are like, this is a lot of conversation. Mm-hmm. The legacy of enslavement, genocide, discrimination against some immigrants is perpetuated in land ownership and control. It seems that must be examined and actively dismantled. She's found it important to look at Reconstruction and the fierce backlash against the leadership of freed peoples, land distribution to freed people, etc. Mm.
If you have resources with any of the things you shared, like the participatory research or any of those, feel free to type those into the chat box too, and we'll circulate them or put them on our website when we post this. So, great.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so Jay is in the room with us. He's on our equity and accountability committee, and he's gonna also say something.
Well, I just wanted to suggest also that it's important to white organizations to keep in mind the interests of people of color with regard to like agricultural policy. Mm-hmm. When that monster comes around every 4 or 5 years, known as a farm bill, mm-hmm. and policies are being implemented with respect to EBT or that sort of thing, it's important to be able to consider the interests of people of color and lobby for policies that serve interests other than the majority white community.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. That's great. Mm-hmm. All right, so we'll continue on. Feel free to keep pop in your questions or thoughts into the chat box. It's great to hear from you. All right, so I have to first say that the next lots of slides have tons of text, and we'll be highlighting Groundswell's, in these slides we're highlighting the meat of what our equity statement is and what it stands for and the goals of it. And so I usually have like a rule that's like no more than 15 words per slide. So I'm giving you a fair warning that there's lots of words, but you know, these resources we'll make available to you. I hope it just didn't really work to have like an image associated with each of the steps of our equity statement. So I couldn't avoid words as we put these together. So this is not a Farming for Justice discussion on PowerPoint best practices, but hopefully it gets to what we all want to know today. So our equity statement, just kind of walking you through our process. The statement is below that section there that starts with the yellow link, takes you to the short version of our equity statement on our website. And so there's the text there is just designed to give you a teaser. You can read the rest of it on our website. But what we started with our statement was context. We say at Groundswell Center, we are committed to the creation of an equitable local food system, one that truly works for all of us. And then we give facts. We have resources that are linked. We state what we mean, and we explain ourselves as an organization and what we stand for. So we're not just making statements that, you know, we believe in inclusivity, we believe in diversity, we believe that the food system should be better. Those are really vague, and it's really important, we felt, to put some meat behind, you know, some meat behind your statements, some research, some facts, and like, why are you standing for what you're standing for? So we really encourage you, if you're thinking about writing equity statements or even just sharing why this work is important in an organization, to do your homework and be able to explain yourself. We, like always, as an educational organization, as a nonprofit, like to share resources. So when we've mentioned things that don't work in our food system, like you can see in the paragraph below, we link to resources that help explain this better than, you know, we can explain ourselves, and historical and present day actions that are keeping these things in place. So share resources so others can learn more, and, you know, try to be a resource yourself as much as you can. It's always okay to say you don't know the answer, but you can come back and answer somebody's question later. If you're making a statement or saying what you want to do, back up with how you're going to do it. And that's what we'll be getting into momentarily, about how we're like the action steps that we're actually taking to try to achieve these equity goals. I encourage you to really strive to think big. Our food system's a mess, and we have to take part in changing that, but also don't set unrealistic goals. Like I mentioned before, like for us to say at Groundswell, we're gonna be 100% organization led by people of color, only people of color, wouldn't be realistic, I don't believe, in our upstate New York area. It might be realistic in other areas of the country, but for the audiences that we serve and engage with, I hope our statement, our goal is actually to be more than 50%, and that seems realistic, and it will take a lot of time, and we have steps to get there. And so yeah, really think big, but don't set yourself up for not achieving the goals, or and realize that these take time. They won't happen overnight. They won't happen in a year, even 2 or more. Be unique and original. You know, you might, if you're writing a statement, or you're just thinking about how you might integrate this even just internally into your work, really be original so it fits with the mission of your organization, and the objectives of your organization. You know, don't just obviously take other people's statements and believe them to be your own. And with that, use your own words. So we're going to be going through our 8 commitments of our statement, and on our website we have just the numbered section of what you'll see, like number 1, number 2. But here today we're diving into the long version of what we use internally to hold ourselves accountable and keep these things always happening, and being more specifics about how we're actually applying this. So our first commitment, create an anti-racist environment where all staff, board members, and volunteers are seen, respected, and supported to participate fully. And fully is really, to have voice, to be heard, to be respected, no matter what background you're coming from, and what differences you might bring to the table. So I list some really specific steps that fit that are really general, but then I'll tell you specifically more of what we've done here at Groundswell. We've organized and hosted anti-racism trainings for the leadership of the organization, for board members, for advisory committee members, and for staff. And we also made those anti-racism trainings open to the public. We were able to leverage our power and access to resources to get funding to host those trainings. So we were able to then offer those for really low cost or for free to people in the community that we work with, like the other farmers and food providers and food system workers, and individuals who otherwise might not have taken that training. We instituted within our staff, we instituted monthly staff meeting time. So we meet weekly as a staff, and once a month we started doing internal self-education on topics of racial justice, food justice, the refugee experience, because that's an audience we work with. What does equity look like in fundraising and development? Our development manager would bring things like that. So anytime we've done gender issues, any topic that relates to this, we spend an hour once a month talking as a staff, reading a resource, and then having those discussions. And for us, we were all white staff a few years back, and when we started that, and so now that we're a multicultural staff, that's also, it doesn't change that we do that education, but it's also important to be aware how that might change the type of education or the experience, especially for us. There's only one person of color on staff, so we also realize that sometimes this is just work for white people and sometimes it's not. We've committed to our ongoing education and self-awareness of these topics. So we support professional development experiences, both for all our leadership, not just staff, but people on boards and committees. We provide funding for them to go take trainings or go to conferences to take part in either caucused or not caucused educational opportunities. We started orienting anyone who is a contractor and works for Groundswell. We've started orienting them to our equity efforts. And this is a place of challenge for us. We rely a lot on outside contractors to do our instruction. And so how do we make sure that those outside contractors are upholding the values that we believe in? And this is something we've been working on for a few years and still continue to do this. And that means we have to recognize that some of those outside contractors might not be the best person to be an outside contractor. We are also in the process of writing a new policy which would require all staff, board members, and organizational leaderships to attend a certain number of trainings a year. And we're in the process of writing that, which will be it's being drafted now and will be hopefully implemented in 2020. So. You want to talk about this?
Sure. So our second point in our equity policy is supporting food justice education and racial justice awareness, not only within Groundswell, but in our wider community. So this is pretty self-explanatory, but it's not necessarily easy. Coming from the perspective of an agricultural organization, sometimes it's the question of why food justice and why racial justice when we're just talking about farming. But as some of you who are tuning into this call have stated that you can't have sustainable and regenerative agriculture without food justice, without racial justice awareness. And so in that, we acknowledge and honor whose land we reside and grow on, and understand why and who. So as you've seen, we start everything that we do with acknowledging the land that we're on, whether it's here in our hometown of Ithaca, or we're somewhere else doing a presentation. Like we learn and educate ourselves to be able to see where we actually are, and chances are it's on unceded territory, and we do our best to educate ourselves in what that means and the implications of it. I would say that we're also lucky in that sense to be part of a land access working group, actually having conversations around, what land really means in the regards of marginalized communities and the indigenous communities, and the indigenous community here and the implications of that. We also host public food justice and anti-racism events and trainings, incorporate food justice into the curriculum, workshops, and services. We organize anti-racist trainings for the wider community, or we hope to do that more often. We host community field trips to people of color owned and food justice oriented farms and organizations. We established ally organizations, and we recognize that we are also an ally organization and put ourselves out there as such, and we share our lessons learned with others, and so in that, it's important to acknowledge as well that all of this is like a learning process, and that there's a balance between how we're going to be a beginning farming agricultural organization, and also be food justice and be aware of racial justice in that, and those intersections, and what's the balance of that, and how does that really work out to be able to accomplish what we're trying to do, but also do it in a way that we're not perpetuating the same thing over and over again. And this is part of the reason I think why we're doing this Farming for Justice webinar, to be able to talk about our experiences in what we're doing and how we're doing it, and then also the challenges that we find.
In relation to the first point, I think first point, or maybe all of the points. But Elizabeth asked if we compensate our board members. So in New York State, nonprofits are not legally allowed to pay board members. But we do other things. We provide dinner at all board meetings. Our board meetings are at night, and so we always provide dinner, and we can provide stipends for transportation or childcare if a board member needs that or wants that, so that's made available to board members. Our Equity Accountability Committee is the only committee of the board that is compensated, and that is a committee that's all made up of all people of color, and we're still trying to recruit refugee representatives on that committee as well, and that we are allowed to compensate monetarily. We also provide food. We provide food at all our committee meetings, but yeah, so no compensation for the board, but compensation for other committees, and other things that we ask people to do. Serve on the interview committee. People are compensated for serving on the interview committee, for reviewing applications, for joining the interviews, anything like that. And so whenever we are able to compensate, we do compensate. And it's very rarely, other than that board example, that we aren't able to compensate. So good question. All right, so our third goal is to develop collaborative and supportive relationships with people of color and organizations led by people of color. And like I mentioned in our steps, this wasn't the first step to start doing, but is actually the third of the four steps for building relationships. We extend and deepen our support for local farmers, gardeners, and growers of color, immigrant and refugee communities. And this really takes intention, for developing the relationships and extending and deepening support for farmers of color. There's not that many farmers of color, and there's not that many farmers of color in New York State or in a few hours from us. And so we host volunteer days, you know, to give you an example, we host volunteer days at our incubator farm monthly. And so one of those monthly in the summer, one of those in the month, we decided to ask a farmer of color in the area if they want an influx of volunteers at their farm instead. So we're able to, you know, leverage our access to this volunteer network and free helping hands on the farm and move that to a different location and help kind of spread that wealth of manual labor. And just highlight farmers of color, highlight businesses owned by people of color in the area in various ways through either when we can, like if there's food businesses owned by people of color, we try to hire those as catering for our meetings or for our events and prioritize that. Really think about where we're spending our money and who our dollar is impacting. So those are a couple of examples. We try to help leverage our resources in other ways too. So we have a somewhat small office space, but it's a meeting space enough for 14 people, and we make it available for groups that have missions similar to ours or in line with ours to use the space for meetings for free. Like the Immigrants' Right Coalition has met here many times. There was a Spanish class offered here for a few months, things like that, just like making our resources available for others. We also in 2017 instituted that all full-time staff have a 5-hour quote-unquote volunteer commitment. Until we are a majority people of color led organization, then full-time staff here get compensated like as part of their salary to go volunteer at another organization that is led by people of color in the area. So we have staff engaged in different groups in town and are able to, you know, they're building relationships. While they're getting paid for that time, they're still able to then provide support for another organization. We don't do that for part-time people because it's just hard timing wise, but we do that for full-time people. We also ask all our leadership to show up at people of color led events and community events and things like that, and show support. It's not just, you know, people of color coming to us and supporting us and being part of us, but all of us supporting them. We took a really active stance to shift the number of people of color teaching and consulting for us as an organization. We, in 2018, our farm business course, which is a 10-week farm business planning course, 40% of the instructors were people of color. And that took time. I think that it took about two years fully to get to that point. We're still always looking for other people of color who have different skill and desire to teach different topics of farming or farm business, and either provide, you know, have them just start joining and teaching, or if they're interested in teaching and they need more support to become a teacher, we can also do that too. This is a bunch at once.
So I'll just finish reading off some of these equity policy statements. There's so many of you who have, I just want to say that there's a lot of you that are having some really awesome points that we will definitely make a point to leave time to touch upon. So in our equity policy, step 4 is implementing a hiring protocol that creates accessible position descriptions that value lived experiences as well as traditional experiences. I know we touched upon this already. Continuously reviewing the website, promotional materials, and course descriptions for languages and images that highlight racial, social justice, and inclusive appropriate language. We do this pretty often, actually, together in the office. We also work with staff and board members to ensure that our meetings and events are accessible, including but not limited to providing childcare and transportation as needed. And so, I mean, Elizabeth just talked about that at length. And, you know, this isn't easy work. You know, upholding this policy is not easy in the organization, and it definitely presents itself in such form as like growing pains, growth spurts.
The last two we talked about number 7 already because of Elizabeth's question with our compensated committee. Our equity and accountability committee is made up of people of color and allies to our work that we've built relationships with over a number of years. The explanation of the committee is on our leadership page on our website, but they provide, so we meet about every other month, sometimes more often if needed, and sometimes there's email exchange happening in between. If there's, a question or guidance needed on something. But this group provides really the guidance and the feedback on all of our equity efforts. And we're really trying to figure out the best way to institute how all of that great work that's happening at the equity committee really seeps in and influences all of the board and the other committees. And so we'll talk about challenges in a moment, but that's one of the challenges, is that overlap between equity committee, and then the other committees in the board. But we work with this committee annually to look over these things that we're telling you now. And we keep an ongoing list of all of our equity efforts that we've been keeping that list since 2016. And so we just, like all of us as staff, and add to it all the time, and connect with other leadership to say, well, what are your equity efforts? And we kind of keep an ongoing tally, whether that's like a meeting with somebody or a training or some significant action or new policy, just so we can keep ourselves accountable and we figure out which of these numbers those steps actually relates to. So we just did this last month with the equity committee, and do it about every fall. And then I mentioned number 8, our goal is to be at least a 50% people of color led organization as a staff and leadership. And we're nowhere near this. I think that this will take, maybe a few more years, but we're moving towards this every year slowly. I mentioned that this is in our bylaws, and it is part of our plan to have a more democratic governance policy and methods in the organization. And in a lot of this, I am the executive director and I am white, and so it's also my work to be aware when to step back, when am I actually getting in the way of this work. And the equity committee is also really great in helping me see that when that's happening. So I'm really grateful for having accountability partners just hold me accountable as the ED of the organization. Some of the challenges that we face, we've mentioned some of these, but for from 2009 to 2016, we were known as a beginning farmer training organization. And when we really started diving into this equity work, there was a lot of I don't know what Groundswell is or how I fit in from the farmers that have been engaged for so long with us. And that those are white farmers. So that's something that we still are figuring out. This discussion group is one approach to that. Hosting public events that really integrate topics of farming and justice is one approach to that. Having individual conversations with farmers, making this, the state show up for racial justice says, call in, not call out. We think about that a lot with engaging farmers in these efforts. So that's been challenging. For us, that hump, maybe it's a hill or a mountain from multicultural org to anti-racist org, we ebb and flow back and forth there, and sometimes get back to tokenizing at times, especially in fundraising efforts. And we constantly are trying to figure out how to really move towards that anti-racist org organization part of the chart. I mentioned our equity policy, kind of moving it up out of the staff and into the rest of leadership. We're working on that now with the draft policy that we're working on with the equity committee that will be instituted in 2020, we hope. Being an organizational ally in the community, I think this is an important role for all of us to play as individuals and as organizations, but it also can be really tricky. And so there's groups, we were asked to take part in a webinar series, for example, from another beginning service provider organization. And they sent me the list of topics and the speakers. And I said, this sounds great. These are great topics. I think people would be really interested in this. Is there any flexibility in who's speaking? I know a few people of color who could be on this list instead of all the white men who were on that list. And is there a way to integrate topics of equity into this webinar series. And they said no. They said that's your audience, but this is a statewide program. That's not our audience. And so we have to figure out, you know, what is our role then as Groundswell to say this is not our audience and our issue. This is an issue in farming. We have to realize that this is all our issues and how we serve as an ally to uphold our ethics in the larger context. And then I think we already talked about the relationship piece. So we'll move on so we have time for questions and comments. A couple of resources listed here you can find on our website. And then I think, yeah, if that's it, we can open it up. You can take yourself off mute. Alexa said there's some questions in the comment box we can answer, but there was a lot of information, I feel like, and a lot of talking at you, so, and words. So thanks for listening. And if you have questions, type them or ask them, and Alexis can read any that have already been typed.
So I just want to go back to Marjorie. She was saying that in response to one of the other questions, they had hired people in the community and built their skills. They listened to their vision for their community food system and listened to the description of the covert racism in the community that they didn't see because they were white. I think that is so amazing. I just really wanted to say that and highlight that because I think that probably has had a profound effect on the work that you're doing. And then also I wanted to address Suzanne. She was saying that she struggles with language and concepts and doesn't want to sound abstract or inflated. That said, it seems to her that it's awkward to frame, quote, white culture, unquote, as a monolith. It also obscures the active, skilled, and resourceful leadership and resistance of people who have been working to do what they can, when they can, to change oppressive systems. And then she listed some resources. And also I did some listing of
Can I just comment on that first one?
Yeah.
Yeah, as far as the white culture, it is a monolith. I mean, I think there's a lot to discuss there. You know, as you described, like there's some of us who have done so much work in this and are so aware and so committed. And I think of myself as one of those people, but I still was raised in, you know, I'm still racist. Like was raised to be racist because that's what society does. And so as much as I try to break down that way of being, it exists. And I'm, you know, it took me many years to be able to say that out loud and like recognize that, and it's painful. But so as much as we can continue to work on it, I guess for myself as a white person, and I guess I believe that basically all white people just have to constantly be holding ourselves accountable, holding ourselves in check, recognizing our privilege and our ways of white culture that we can only know, we're aware of some of it, and then we're not aware of some of it, and we don't know what we don't know. And so I think that's why I guess I feel comfortable still using that whole term white culture or white supremacy in a sense as a monolith because it is, and it's so much bigger than what like I know.
Yeah, and then I also wanted to touch on that as well in the sense where when we are creating these working statements for the organization, this is part of the reason that we have our equity and accountability committee, is because we do talk about language. We do sit down and break down some of these things because these conversations do come up. And it's important that when we're talking about things that we are growing together, informing each other of our understanding of why we believe things should be a certain way, and then agree to agree or agree to disagree. And usually we agree to agree because that's how things move forward. But that doesn't always happen. But it's really, you know, I think on the larger scale, like that conversation comes up very often. And it really lends itself to the conversation about like a settler colonial mentality and Western culture and a colonized culture, and tending towards languages that are talking more about the actual societal structure than trying to single out certain people or races. And in that sense, like we're trying to talk about marginalized communities as being historically discriminated, historically marginalized, and language like that, because when we say people of color, we're also not actively including refugees, immigrants, and then also the other communities that wouldn't readily identify as people of color, like the indigenous community. They don't really consider themselves people of color. It's a very nuanced part of the conversation that we do touch upon here, and I hope that also helps kind of clarify anything you were feeling around white culture.
We will have a recording of this video on our blog in the next week or 7 to 10 days or so. We just do some minor editing, and so then it will be available for you. So if there's any other questions, feel free to say them, or if we can be supportive to any of you in your work and efforts in this, please let us know. Sharing the long version of our equity statement with the points we went over today, we've done often. And if you ever need me as the executive director or Alexis or anybody from our equity committee to talk to your board or your staff and help move this forward and share like the impact that it's had on our organization, we'd be happy to do that. And is part of why we want to share our experiences and lessons learned. And by no means have we figured it all out. We've just figured out at least some structure to figure it out. So thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. And we'll make these slides available.
Yeah, we'll put up the video.
Yeah, and so we'll put up the video, and then if there is any specific information you are looking to have, feel free to email us. I will follow up in an email probably within the next 48 hours for all of you that attended with the evaluation link. Again, please fill out the evaluation. The evaluations are for us, but more so to help the programming to keep going, and the feedback is really important. The reason we have the conversations that we're having to bring forth certain subjects for Farming for Justice is often because people want us to. They have an idea that they would like to hear more about, and it's my job to try to facilitate that. So your feedback is really appreciated. So we'll send that link in the email. Also, some of the resources that were shared in the chat box, I'll post there as well. And then, of course, if you have any questions, you have our emails here. Feel free to reach out to us.
Thank you. Have a great day. All right. Mute on, mute. And recording stop. All right.